this chapter in its entirety and look at how this reflects Jesus to us. We recall that in the book of Hebrews it says that there are things in the Old Testament that were shadows of Jesus and his gospel. And so we look at Ruth and see, how is this a shadow of Jesus and his gospel? We look at Jesus and what he said in Luke 24 to his disciples upon his resurrection, that the whole Old Testament, the Psalms, prophets, and the law spoke of him. And so we look at the book of Ruth, chapter 2 here this morning, and see how this reflects Jesus, how it teaches us of Jesus this morning. So Ruth chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, this is God's word, eternally true. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Here ends our reading. We have a response of thankfulness printed for us here in our bulletins. The word of the Lord. Thanks indeed. Let's pray. As we look this morning at this text, we looked at Ruth 2 last week as well, and we looked at different reasons why we should have Jesus be our King in all things, why we should look to him for direction in everything. And one note that we made and that we make again this morning, and if you'd like to fill out blanks in an outline, you're welcome to do that and to fill those in as they come up, or you can just listen if that's easier for you. But we note that often we, God's people, individual Christians, that we often are led about by the world. We're led about by its values, its directives, and often this is without realizing it. It's very easy for us to think, oh, the world's doing its thing, but I'm not doing what the world's doing. But we need to recognize and have a realistic view of ourselves. One, that we're in the world 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, if you take a full Sabbath day off. And so 6 days of the week, throughout the day, we've got the world's perspective coming in at us, telling us what's important, what we should value, whom we should be like. And we have this one day, this day that God gives us, it's a day of rest to fully take him in. And certainly through the week, we're reading his word and hopefully thinking upon him and meditating upon him. But we've got a lot that's coming in at us day after day, hour after hour, and that world's perspective comes in on us, and we need to be aware of this first of all. But beyond this, the world's perspective coming in on us, we need to realize that biblically it says that we have this sin nature within us, which also represents the world's system of values. And this is perhaps even stronger for us, that we have sin natures within us that are pulling us or pushing us to be not like Jesus, to not value what Jesus values. One of the things that's very true in the world as we look around, whether it's in the news or whatever it is, or just at our workplace or in our neighborhood, or if we examine our lives, is that the world is a place where people, and we, are seeking our own glory. We're seeking our own glory. Sometimes that's just to ourselves. We're building up ourselves inside and convincing ourselves, I've done this right, or I'm doing this better than other people do that. That's building ourselves up to our own glory. Sometimes it's by putting others down. We build ourselves up. We are seeking glory. Often so much driving us, in addition, is the opinions of others. And we really care about what others think of us. I struggle with that. I'm assuming you struggle with that too. That other people's opinions, other person's opinions of us matter to us. And so we live that they might approve us or give us glory. And this is a passage that tells us, it tells you and it tells me, quit seeking your own glory. Quit seeking to be glorified by others. We see that in Ruth, and Ruth reflects Jesus here. Now, last week we talked about different reasons to make Jesus our King in all things. And we learned from Ruth 2 that we should make Jesus our King in all things because he's more admirable than anybody. Anybody who's ever lived the face of the earth, Jesus did things and taught things, and he has accomplished things that nobody else has accomplished. He rose from the dead. That's a pretty good one. His teaching is renowned. And even though people often don't realize what they mean when they say, treat others the way you want to be treated, those of you who did watch Fresh Off the Boat this week in its initial season, the main character in there he tells his wife, I need to treat my customers the way I would like to be treated. And he quotes this teaching of Jesus, but there's, often not a recognition that comes from him, but that came from Jesus, and how different from the world that is. The world tells us, treat others the way they've treated you. But Jesus tells us to love our enemies and to pray for those who have persecuted us, to be kind to those who have been wicked to us and ungrateful. Luke 6. So we follow Jesus because he's more admirable than anyone else. He's done more. He's taught better things than anybody's taught. We also learn from Ruth 2, 4 letters, from Ruth 2 last week, that we follow Jesus in all things because he's worked hard for us. Like Ruth, who's admirable, like Ruth, Jesus also works hard for us. Ruth comes and she works hard for the sake of her mother-in-law. And Jesus came to this earth and he worked hard for us. In fact, he worked literally unto death. He worked himself to death. Though his work for us cost him his life, he said, in essence, I don't care. If that's what my people need, that's what I give. I will work to my death for them. And so if anyone's earned our consideration as king, it's Jesus. Nobody else has worked unto death for us. So we follow him. But there's one more reason. There's one more reason that we'll talk about here from Ruth 2, that we follow Jesus in all things, that we look to him for guidance in everything we're doing, and that's this. And that's why your first point here is a number 3 point, because it's left over from last week. Number 3 here, God says to you from Ruth 2, make Jesus your king in all things because he is humble. Not only is he more admirable than everybody, not only has he worked harder than anybody and for you, make Jesus your king because he is humble. If you've been around here a while, I appreciate the show Seinfeld. I didn't watch it when it was on for a while. When it first came on, we didn't have TV. And then when it was on later in its years, I was in seminary, so I wasn't watching much TV then anyway. But one show I did watch, I watched about 20 minutes of the finale, which was, I guess, my 3rd year of seminary. And it didn't make any sense to me. And I went to campus the next day and was in class. And Mike Loto said a lot of people watched the finale who had not watched the show. And, of course, it didn't make any sense to them. And I thought, yeah, that's me. But what didn't make sense to me in the finale was the whole show. It's not a show about nothing. The show is about how we are always seeking for ourselves. But we don't want others to know that we're seeking for ourselves. If you know the show Seinfeld, you know that that's true. They're always seeking, all the characters are seeking to get the most glory they can get. They're seeking to be considered great in the eyes of others and to get as much as they can without others knowing how selfish they are. And so a lot of their conversations are figuring out, how can I get all this stuff for myself without being found out for being as selfish as I am? And Kramer is probably the least concerned about other people finding out he's selfish. He just comes in Jerry's apartment and eats his cereal, right? Eats all, just helps himself to all his food there. But that's I think one of the reasons the show resonates with all of us is because, and I mean all of humankind who watches this show, is because we know that's what we struggle with. We struggle with wanting other people to think well of us, that we're not an anti-dentite or whatever the case may be. And but we're very selfish inside. We want people to think well of us. But at the same time, we want to get from them whatever we can get from them. And this is our sin nature within us. But there's a gospel cure for this. Unlike the characters of Seinfeld, or unlike us in our own sin natures that bleeds out of us many times, Jesus didn't live for his own glory. Jesus didn't live for his own glory. That's the gospel. That's good news for us. He didn't come to this earth to live for his own glory, but he came to earth to live for us, to live in humility. And in fact, during his life here on earth, he shirked glory. He avoided glory. He healed people and he said, don't tell anybody. Right? He wasn't seeking glory when he came to this earth. He had glory in heaven and he left that. He was divine, Philippians 2, and he came to this earth and he took the form not only of a human being, but of a servant. So we have this gospel cure for us, but we look first at Ruth and we note her humility. She has great humility, doesn't she, Ruth? What she does is a thing, and the way she communicates, you see this humility coming out of her. She's a model of humility and reverence. She's a model of respect for others rather than demanding others' respect. Look at verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. See this humility? She's not demanding anything from anybody. She just says, maybe somebody out there will let me pick up the leftover grain. And we read from Luke 19, this is a group of poor people. She's seeking to be accepted among a group of poor people. She doesn't know if she will be, but maybe somewhere out there she'll find favor enough to be considered a poor person who can gather grain, who can glean grain at the edge of a field. She's not a field owner. She's not even a harvester. You see this humility in Ruth. Look at verse 10. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She's speaking with Boaz here. Boaz speaks to her, and she bows to him. She exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Ruth knows her place, both as a person and her place in Israel. She's a woman at a time and in a society when women weren't respected. They weren't the landowners. Land was not in their name. Worse than that, she was a widow. She didn't have a husband and a claim on anything. And worse than that, and she points it out here, she brings it up in humility. I'm a foreigner. I have no rights even in this whole land of Israel. So why are you treating me with favor? I don't deserve this. This is Ruth's humility. That's what humility says. Humility says, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you doing anything for me. I don't deserve you letting me do anything that's to my advantage. And that's the attitude of Ruth. Why? Why this grace to me? Why this mercy upon me? And then look at verse 13. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. She's looking at the servant girls who are gleaning. And she says, I don't have their standing. I am the assistant to the regional manager, right? Office fans. There's no such position. Okay, so that's what she says. This is her humility, and it's an example. It's an example to us. And Jesus, this descendant of Ruth, we find out from Ruth chapter 4, Ruth is the great-grandmother of David, and David is the, Jesus is the descendant of David. Okay. Jesus, the descendant of Ruth, has this humility toward his father. In seeing himself, he has this humility when bearing our sins. He sees himself as a recipient of the Father's mercy as he's there upon the cross, and you see how he interacts with his Father there upon the cross. Just as Ruth saw herself as a recipient of mercy as she interacted with Boaz, the one who could redeem her from her state of death all around her. Death of my husband, death of my brother-in-law, death of my mother-in-law's husband. So Matthew 11:28, and I've listed these things for you. Look at what Jesus says. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." This is our Savior. This is our King, one who is gentle and humble in heart. Coming not roaring and demanding, coming not in great power, but coming gentle and humble in heart. Or Matthew 26:39. Going a little further, this is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he fell with his face to the ground. Notice his humility before the Father. He prays, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup," that is his death on the cross, "may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." I'm not demanding anything from you, Father. Do your will. Enable me to do your will. He serves his Father and his Father's wants. He doesn't make demands. He's the servant and the greatest servant of all. And we see this in what Carl read for us this morning in John 13. Jesus shows his disciples this is what it's about. This is what life is about. It's about serving other people. And it encapsulates what Jesus has done. And Jesus gives that imagery for his disciples of washing their feet. This is what the lowliest of servants did in those days. Everybody wore sandals, and the streets were of dust, not of pavement, and people would come into a house and they'd have dirty feet. And the lowest of servants would wash the feet of the guest. And so Jesus took on the position of the lowest servant in the house, and he washed his disciples' feet. It's not about pride and boastfulness and demanding honor and respect. It's about being the greatest of servants, the lowliest of servants. What can I do for you? Isaiah 53:7. We looked at Isaiah 53 in our declaration of the gospel this morning. Isaiah 53:7 says, "He," speaking eventually of Jesus, "he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth." See this humility? He's before Pilate. He created Pilate's position. He created Herod's position. He's the one who sets kings in their places. But he stands before them, and he opens not his mouth. He stands before the Pharisees, and he's quiet as there's conflicting testimony that goes on before him about himself. And he's like a lamb before its shears. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Verse 8, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. Who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. Now, there's a great contrast here between Jesus, between Ruth, and what we see in the world. There's a great contrast to what the world calls us to. Glory and demanding respect. And what Jesus calls us to and shows us by his example. What Ruth, his forebears, showed us by her example that we are to be. We're to be examples of humility. There are people in the world who want all eyes looking upon them. And that's true of us in our sin nature. We want all eyes looking upon us and saying, great job, way to go. Everybody be like him. Look at him. He got the right answer. He scored the goal. We want that for ourselves. And there are people that want that for themselves. And those are the people who tend to be in leadership, who get the attention. Those are the people who grab for leadership. And maybe they'll be nice to you, but it's probably if you can do something for them. It's probably because you're granting them honor. And that's what they're after. They're not after your good. If their own honor, if their own glory is served by dispensing of you, by humiliating you, they just may do that. But that's not the kind of king we have in Jesus. Not a king who's seeking glory. And when we embarrass him by the things we do, he doesn't dispense of us. He doesn't disown us. He doesn't put us down. He owns us. You know, those who seek glory are not worthy of your following. They're not. Those who are seeking glory in this world are not worthy of your following. Have you ever been around somebody who's really humble, who's not seeking glory? Isn't that great? My first full-time boss, my first big person job, when we were first on the staff of Campus Crusade with Athletes in Action, was a guy named Wendell Deo. And actually my mom knew his family. They grew up in the same little town, London, Ohio. And I think he was the youngest of like 5 brothers or something like that. And maybe because of that, because he was the little squirt, and he wasn't really, he still held weightlifting records at his high school, my mom's high school. He knew Dick LeBeau. He played high school there. For those of you who know Dick LeBeau, the defensive coordinator for, used to be for Pittsburgh. He went somewhere else now. But he was my first boss, and a humble guy. And he wasn't looking out for his own glory. And he said things to me at different times during our just brief year and a half there. He didn't care about being embarrassed. And when he was embarrassed about something, he highlighted it, what he had done that was silly or goofy. And it was a great example to me, right there at the start of my adult life. Things that he taught me about humility. It was wonderful being there because he said things that were helpful for me. And he wasn't concerned about his own glory. And we're to be like that. We're to be like Ruth. She's not concerned for her own glory. We see that in her expressions. We're to be, of course, like Jesus. He comes to earth not for his own glory. So this is our King. Favored, hardworking, selfless, loving, and not seeking his own glory, but seeking our well-being. So number 4 in your outline here. We have this hardworking, selfless, loving King. How does this direct our lives? We look at how this directs our lives. What does it mean for our actions? What kind of people does our loving, humble, selfless, non-glory seeking, admirable King, what does he want our lives to look like? And we see this here in Ruth 2. And the first thing is A here in your outline. Be like Jesus, don't seek the limelight. Be like Jesus, don't seek the limelight. Don't seek glory, be humble. Recognize that it's not just other people who seek glory and who are ugly for it, but recognize that it's us too. Recognize about yourself, you seek glory, and when you do, you're ugly, spiritually. I am, When I seek glory for myself, I'm ugly spiritually. So recognize that about yourself. Recognize that about yourself and be humble. The band Rush speaks about the limelight. If you're a Rush fan, you can't hear the word limelight without thinking about that. And they talk about the contrast between those who seek glory on the lighted stage. They talk about their life as a band and how they have to seek beyond that to more important things in life. So we think about this, but we think about this as well, this idea. Jesus had the right to think about glory, and he had the right to demand being glorified because he was perfect. But we don't have that right. We're imperfect people. Beyond that, we're sinful people. And as people of the church, we're even worse because we're people who know God's law. We know we're supposed to love others as we love ourselves. We know we're supposed to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We hear that every week, and we don't, so there's no room for pride. There's no room for boasting. There's no room for boasting in us. We who should be humble are seeking glory. But he who had no cause for embarrassment in the way he lived, Jesus, did not. This is the upside down gospel, isn't it? He who had the right to be glorified didn't seek it. That was Jesus. And that's for us too. Sometimes we do things well. And we have the right, so to speak, to be glorified. But we need to be like Jesus at that point and deflect glory. So we live for self, but we follow a king who did not live for self, who did not seek his own glory. And he calls us to do the same. Consider these New Testament commands, and you've got them listed for you there. James 4:10 says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. That's what we sang this morning. Humble yourselves before the Lord. He'll lift you up at the proper time. 1 Peter 5:5, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another because God opposes the proud. Okay, if you want to be opposed by God, be proud. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand that he may lift you up at the proper time. And then Philippians 2, verse 3, Carl read this for us this morning. Do nothing out of selfish ambition. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. You see that in Ruth? Boaz is better than me. Boaz's servant girls are better than me. Naomi is better than me. Be like Jesus by refusing the limelight and being humble about yourself. You're a sinner. You've admitted such in receiving the gospel. In receiving the gospel, you admitted, I'm a sinner and I need Jesus to be okay. So live that out. Don't live as if that were not true, as if it weren't true that you're a sinner, but live as if it is true that you're a sinner and have the humility that goes along with that. So be like Jesus. Don't seek the limelight. Don't seek the limelight in life. Don't seek the limelight in the church. Second thing, be like Jesus in this. Work hard for others. Ruth 2 teaches us, be like Jesus by working hard for others. We see a bunch of verses here about Ruth and other verses in the New Testament here. So we work hard for others, and then your number one point there, and work hard not for yourself. Work hard, but not for yourself. Work hard for others. Ruth doesn't work hard for herself. Ruth doesn't work hard for herself. She rather gives up all to take care of, through her work, her mother-in-law. She doesn't work hard for herself. She works hard for her mother-in-law, Naomi. And like Ruth and Jesus, have others as your focus, not yourself. And you see how hard Ruth works, and we looked at this last week in verses 2 and 3 and 7 and 17 through 18 that you have listed there in your bulletin. And Jesus instructs us to do this through Paul. He says, again, Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Work for the interests of others, not for yourself. Consider others as better than yourself. How can I work for them? How can I work hard for their sake, for their benefit? And work hard for others, considering, here's your blank, them. Considering them is more important than yourself. Again, from Philippians 2:3. He instructs us to do this through Paul here. Consider others more important than yourself. And then number 2, we work hard for others, not for ourselves, and we work hard out of love for them. We work hard out of love for them. Romans 5:8 tells us why Jesus worked hard. God demonstrates his own love for us in this. He demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5:8. God loved us, and he demonstrated it for us in dying for us, in working to death for us. Working to death, not for his own sake, but for us. We were the others there. So we work hard for others out of love for them. And Ruth and Jesus did this in the gospel. Out of love for her mother-in-law, Ruth works. Out of love for us, Jesus works unto death. And then third thing, number 3 there. And here's a kickback for you and for me. A great benefit for us as we work hard for others, as we live for others, as we work out of love for them. You, in doing this and working hard for others, will be more satisfied. In working hard for others, you will be more satisfied. Look at verse 12 here first in this passage. Now, Ruth leaves everything. She leaves her homeland, any rights she had back there. She leaves her citizenship back there. Okay, think of your citizenship formerly in the dominion of darkness. And now it's in the kingdom of light. Ruth is making that move. But she leaves her citizenship behind. She leaves any land she had behind, any claim her husband had behind, her people behind, the gods she grew up with behind. She leaves all this stuff behind to work hard for her mother-in-law. And she's selfless. But listen to what Boaz says, verse 12. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. God rewards those who work hard for others. He rewards those who work hard for others. That's the message of Ruth here. She didn't consider herself. She said, how might I love Naomi? Jesus didn't consider himself. How might I work hard for my people? What might I do for them? And so he leaves heaven and comes to this earth to live and to die and to rise for us. Or look at verse 9 here about Ruth. Watch the field where the men are harvesting. This is how Ruth is being repaid for her selflessness, for her working hard for others. Boaz says, watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you. This means she's not going to get abused or raped. Okay? As a person with no rights. that could have happened to her. And you see that reflected in what Naomi says to her at the very end of this passage as well. But Boaz protects her, and Ruth is rewarded for her selflessness. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told them not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water of the jars the men have filled. And then beyond this, verses 14 through 18, we see the abundance that Ruth winds up with. She is blessed. Boaz makes sure that she's not just gathering up the scraps, but her harvesters are actually putting out wheat for her to pick up from their own bundles. And he invites her to his table, and he gives her all the food she can eat and more than she can eat. And she has more that she can take home, like we said last week, in a doggy bag and give to her mother-in-law from that meal. She didn't leave it on the table like I did once at Red Lobster, right? But she's satisfied. She's satisfied as a result of her working hard for somebody else. What if she had stayed in Moab? Would she have experienced this blessing, this satisfaction of working hard and being commended, working hard and having her belly filled, working hard and having a mother-in-law who just can't imagine such love that's been expressed toward her? And so she's satisfied. This was the case for Jesus too. We saw it in Isaiah 53:11. It's this passage where it says, after the suffering of his soul, he will be satisfied. Jesus gives up all to suffer. But what Isaiah tells us is after the suffering of his soul, he will be satisfied. We're satisfied because there's great, and here's your blank here, there's great blessing. There's great blessing in living for others and working hard for them out of love. Paul quotes Jesus. We actually don't hear Jesus say this in the gospel, but Paul quotes him in Acts chapter 20 as Paul's talking to the elders at Ephesus. And he says, as our Lord told us, he said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. And this is what keeps things like Habitat for Humanity alive. And that's a good thing. These organizations of good works. Because people discover, I have a good feeling inside when I do things for other people and there's no benefit for me. I don't get paid when I go on a Saturday and work for Habitat for Humanity. And maybe nobody sees it whom I know. But I feel good inside. See, that's blessing. It's more blessed to give than to receive. The perspective of the world, going back to the very beginning of us talking this morning, the perspective of the world is it's more blessed to receive than to give. To spend our lives getting and spending, as Wordsworth said, right? I'm an English major, forgive me. But Jesus says the opposite. It's more blessed to give than to receive. And that's what Ruth shows us here. It's more blessed to give. It's more blessed to leave everything behind. Jesus says, unless you leave father or mother and land or all relations for me and my gospel, you're not worthy of being my disciple. But everybody who leaves land and houses and brothers and sisters and fathers of mothers will be rewarded over the top with these things here in this life and in the life to come. What do you mean by that? That we're going to have 5 houses? No. It means that we'll have brothers and sisters in Christ. And wherever we are because of that, we'll have a place to stay. And instead of just having one brother and one sister like I have, I've got all of you. A multitude of brothers and sisters. And if I go to some other town and I'm there on a Sunday, I can go into a church and there are my brothers and sisters. My soul is enriched greatly. So there's great blessing in living for others. It's more blessed to give than receive. So work hard for others, not for yourself. And paradoxically, we understand from the gospel that working hard for others instead of working for ourselves is more satisfying. This is what Jesus actually experienced. His leaving everything behind, taking the form of a human being, taking on human flesh, and in that, the form of a servant, being the servant of all, the greatest of servants, washing feet, dying for sins, serving us by serving our penalty for sin, death, the wrath of God, and the cursed death of the cross, as we talked about in his humiliation from our confession of faith this morning. This is how our Savior, our King, serves us, taking upon himself the wrath of God, the cursed death on the cross, being found in appearance as a man. So this, service to others, working hard for others, out of love and not for ourselves, brings us more joy. And most importantly, as we do this, we're following our King. And we're showing others by acting in this way what our King is like. His character can be seen in us. And we glorify him in that way. And people can pause and consider, why are you doing this? What benefit is there for you in doing this for me? So the non-believers around us can say as we live this out. And maybe, just maybe, that will cause them, like Boaz and like all of Bethlehem, to take notice that there's something else going on here. There's something weird going on here. Someone has stepped out of his own culture, out of the value system of the world. Somebody has quit looking out for himself or herself and is looking out for somebody else. And they take notice, and maybe that will be the thing that brings them to faith in Jesus. So conclusion here from last week and from this week. Take Jesus as your King in all things and be like him in love. Be like him in love. Be like him in hard work for others. And be like him in having no care for the limelight. When you get the limelight in your heart, say, yuck, get me out of here. That's what Jesus did. He healed people and said, don't tell anybody. This is our King, and this is what we're called to do.